Starting now. Hello, good afternoon. We are about to start. So those who are still outside, please come in. And so we have about 80 minutes for this session. So this is the opening panel of our public event, which is associated with our annual general meeting. My name is Dorothy Guerrero, or many of you have know me by the name Dottie. I'm head of policy with Global Justice Now. And for those that are viewing us via YouTube, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And we have 80 minutes of discussion on climate breakdown, reparations, and a just transition. So for those that are in the room, you are familiar that Global Justice Now has been campaigning on climate justice for many years now, and the fact that in the last few years, is it okay? Okay. So I don't see what's on the screen actually. For the past, we can say for more than a decade now, climate change is at the center of many policy and problem solving processes. So all the World Economic Forum, meetings of international financial institutions, meeting of G7, G20, many UN meeting, climate change or what's happening, which is now a climate emergency, has been in the top three agenda. And that is continuing. That continued even during the height of the pandemic. And it rightly so that people see that it's still a threat, not just here, but most especially for those in the global south. And what has also was made possible by the UK's hosting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change 26 Conference of Parties, so the COP, was that climate change was on our screen, and for the first time, the 2 weeks of negotiation was followed live. It was like the Olympics, where every hour we heard what the negotiators from various countries are been saying and putting forward on the table. And the UN COP is also an important political arena. It's the only political arena where 197 countries come together and discuss about climate. And what we are also clear about now is that what the campaigners have been saying for many, many years, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt. So it is only in the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years, that floods are in our doorstep, that we are feeling more warm during summer, while in the global south, they had been experiencing longer droughts, uh, fast disappearing territory because their lands are being claimed by the sea. A few weeks ago, I was in Senegal, and I was pointed to the fact that some of the houses are now under sea level. That I have seen some of the foundations of the houses, because the people had to move almost every 2 to 3 years. The sea is claiming 20 meters of the coastline. So in some countries, that is already happening, and that is real, and that is also generally felt in the south. But also, when we talk about climate change, we also talk about not just the causes, but it is clear it is human made, but not every human are equally guilty at the same amount of emitting. There's also a disproportionate share of the emission between the global north and the global south. And the UK, as one of the countries with the biggest historic responsibility, UK shares of global emission is between 4 to 5% of the global emissions since 1750. So since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And it is the biggest historic emitter. But that is only what is accounted as domestic emissions. If we count the global emission level, which would come from its days, centuries of empire, its activities and operations during the time and periods of colonization, and the continuing role of the transnational corporations that are based in this country in extraction, in terms of grabbing resources from the south, then that would be much, much higher. So Global Justice now decided that if we wanted to work stronger and more meaningfully with our allies in the South, we also wanted to work on climate reparations. Climate reparations is actually not new. It was already being debated in the climate negotiation as early as 2006, 2007, when many governments of the developing countries were saying that we are actually not in debt of the North. Actually, we are the creditor when it comes to climate change. And the North actually have a climate debt to the South. So the idea of reparations is also emanating from the fact that when we are looking at challenges and difficulties posed by climate change, we are also looking at conflicts. And that conflicts is also interstate, it's also interclass, so between north and the south, and also within countries interclass, because also when we look at the north, the center and periphery discussions in many developing countries, the capital is also emitting a lot compared to the rest of the countries. So when we talk of climate reparations, we mean that we wanted to advance a discourse that will provide a comprehensive organizing principle for claims against those most responsible, while placing ethics and justice concerns at the center of the debate. So, climate reparations as a central demand of many developing countries put those questions of ethics and justice at the center. We know that it is disproportionate impacts, and but then at the same time, there are effects, there are guilty parties from the past, at the present, and continuing in the future as well. So that is why we're saying that we have to start talking about climate reparations and claim it back in the various political processes that are available. Because in the negotiation itself, it was pushed sometime 2007, 2008, but then the rich countries, the UK, I mean the US, EU countries block it. And they said that we don't want to talk about climate reparations. We don't want to talk about climate debt. It's not in the agenda. And then in the 2012, they agreed, okay, we can talk about loss and damage. But loss and damage is very tame compared to the idea of climate debt and compared to the need of climate reparations. So in terms of what we will do this afternoon, so for this session, I want all of you to participate at the same time. Of course, first listen to our speakers that will lay out what do we mean by climate reparations, how is it being advanced in the discussions, at the same time in the various struggles and conflicts, both in the north, but especially in the south, and at the same time, what are the alternatives being advanced by the various communities, the various social movements that are pushing for it. So it is not just by those that are working on the democratization or reform of international financial institutions. It's not just within the climate justice movement, but now it is gaining ground, especially in this country with the youth sector. In Glasgow, as what Nick mentioned, one of the hope that we have seen, despite the very gloomy discussions and reality on climate change, is that many young activists, young people are discussing about now how can we actually push for justice for southern countries. So for this afternoon, we are very, very lucky to have very notable speakers. We have, I will introduce them now and then call them later. And I have explained to them that we have limits with the setting in the room. For those in the morning, you have seen it, that we have one microphone. And also for those that are online, to see us on YouTube, the speakers needed to speak here in front, and then in the question and answer, we'll see what will be most feasible, because people can also shout their questions or comments, and I can repeat it, or we can also come here and then speak as well. So for our first speaker, for those who are following the negotiation, we have seen Lumumba Diaping at work. We have seen him as the chief climate negotiator for G77 and China countries, which is also the biggest bloc in the climate negotiation. And it's not just 77 countries. You can say more about that. So we have the African Union in it. We have the climate vulnerable countries. We have the small island states. And in the through the years of the negotiation, Lumumba has championed the cause of the developing countries. He called out countries in the global north for colonizing the sky. He questioned the insistence of the northern countries in Copenhagen, COP15, that what is on the table, what was agreed as capping the global average climate warming to 2 degrees centigrade, actually is not acceptable. It's actually not the beginning of the solution. He's a diplomat. He's also a radical economist. He's a climate justice advocate from South Sudan, a former diplomat, and also at the same time, his background is also working on trade and also working on the reforms within international financial institutions, which actually fits our organization, our campaigns to a T, because all of those issues that we've been working on are also things that he pushed on the political arena and in the diplomatic circle. So without much ado, I would like to call Lumumba Diaping as our first speaker. Lumumba.
Where is the microphone?
You can just speak.
Good afternoon. I'm truly privileged to be amongst you today for the reasons that you are here, for your commitment to the struggle, for what the most critical.
Could you speak up, please?
I try my best. I'll try my best. I have a tendency to drop my voice when the issues are difficult to deal with. So I want to thank you for your true commitment of your thoughts, your energies, your resources, okay, to advance the issues of climate change, climate justice, reparations, equity. It's a real privilege to be amongst you. And I want you to know none can go forward without your participation. This is one. The second thing that I want to say is that today we meet at a very important moment in the history of the struggle for climate justice and reparations. Because it has become now self-evident that global efforts since Rio Conference 1972 have not been heeded. And the goals set in 1994 March by United Nations Conventions on Climate Change of preventing dangerous human interference with climate systems have been subverted by the global north political and economic elites and their industrial complexes and denialists into a simple process of destruction by inaction. This is the process that we have been living the last 50 years. Day after day, the carnage is spreading. The central idea of the United Nations efforts was to exert and commit all efforts to stabilize greenhouse concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate systems. What we have now is greenwashing, pure and simple. And as a result, we live a real crisis across the world. 30 years ago, we lived this in the global south. But the north, some of the misguided people thought that the thawing of ice will be helpful to them. IPCC in April 2022 stated that 1.5 degrees Celsius will be reached in the early 2030 in all emission scenarios considered, except the highest emissions scenario, for which the 1.5 degrees Celsius will even occur earlier. So the truth is that the Earth and the planet is set on a global average temperature rise increase of 3.2 to 5.7 degrees Celsius. This the finding of world scientists, hundreds and thousands of them. The truth is that the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we celebrated and we continue to celebrate being goaded into commemorating humanity's peril, becoming the earth becoming our bleak house of extinction. Accepting and aiding and abetting making the world unlivable. This is what we have done in 2015. And not only accepting that, but accepting that we, our common home, the earth, has become part of the industrial. I don't know, I can't find an eloquent word except to say industrial waste. We are perishable. We don't matter. Humanity doesn't matter. And the world doesn't matter. So climate, the global South climate claim for reparations is a struggle which is a continuum of our struggle against colonization, against extinction of natives across the world. Can think about the Americas, against enslavement, subjugation, appropriation of lands, wealth, and the atmospheric space. And all of you would know that when the Dutch started this industrialization and expansion, followed by the British establishing the first coal estate, an industrial complex that then led to the current carnage We have been the the North has been silent about the suffering and the exploitation of non-whites. Pure and simple. There's no way of hiding it. I don't think adjectives do exist to describe that. So climate reparations and climate justice are in essence about saving our common home. This planet in which we lived and thrived against the scourge of the metabolic rift of industrialization, the marsh and the expansive marshes of injustice and the deluge of inequality in every inch across the world. The mark of today is injustice and inequality and level of stratification that are just frightening. And why? Simply because there is a hubris that humanity or man, quote unquote, can control nature, can use the, everything as a resource for creating wealth. But there is another important issue that I want and you all aware of is that this struggle is being challenged by the powerful. The struggle of the South for climate reparations has its own Andrew Johnsons. And most of you who know the American history, Andrew Johnson is the American president who rolled back all the struggle for all what Lincoln did against slavery. He's the forefather of the Confederate flag. And you will see them. The other day I was in a session where a few denialists came to try to disrupt us. And that's one form. But the most dangerous form is what I call soft denialism, which is really what the G7 states and G7 intellectuals have adopted as their way of inaction. There's a there's racism of the National Party, and there is the racism of make UK hostile of the former Prime Minister. So who needs a denialist? I think that's one of the reasons why we don't hear about the denialist anymore, because now it is the establishment that prevents any meaningful action. As such, we need to really ask ourselves, what should we do? My own opinion is that there are three central issues that we have to address. The issue of radical reductions of emissions, because the 1.5 degrees Celsius, as IPCC has already mentioned, is simply carnage. Forget about 2 degrees. And I want you, if we are 3.27 to 5.7 degrees global average, that translate to 3 to 4 times that in the global south. In Africa, that's what happened. That's why it was possible 20 years ago for Lake Chad and River Niger, etc., to disappear. And nobody actually thought that was a threat. Now we have seen what is happening in Italy, in the River Po. That was coming because, unlike the refugee crisis, there's no border. You cannot block the air. You cannot block the atmospheric space and the changes that are happening globally. The second issue is that the issues that we have to address through uh, um, reduction of emissions are actually about addressing the whole planetary boundaries that are being totally destroyed. The biodiversity, the ocean acidification, the total destruction of agriculture, water, uh, sea level rise, all these issues are what we are facing. It's effectively, it's like a cancer hitting the world from every single corner. And there's no place that is safe. And if we are going to, even those industrialists who think that they're going to go to Mars, if they go to that with that attitude, they will destroy it. Now, the other central issue I want to stress here is that climate reparations is not aid. Climate reparations is not a charitable act from the north towards the underprivileged and the wretched of the earth. It is actually about justice, about all the things that they have historically expropriated and they continue to destroy. And many of you are aware that in the last report on reparations from Africa, India, let me put it this way, India alone has a right to claim from the British Empire $45 trillion. Africa, through the looting that happened from across Europe in general, is over 777 trillion. This is the magnitude of what happened. Now, I want to say, because I'm running out of time, there's another folly being cooked. It's called the New Green Deal. The problem with the New Green Deal, it has no target towards reductions of emissions because they know very well net zero is about inaction. It's kicking the ball to 2050. Different scenarios of doing that. Living comfortably, okay? You move from this to that, but there is no radical reductions of emission. There is no comprehensive energy transition of renewables or anything. So this is one. And the second thing, of course, the problem with all the global efforts from the North, they really Western centric. The IMF, the World Bank, etc., is about the G7 and the welfare of the G7. Even though now it has an element of a clear disregard to and destruction of the welfare state in the West. As we have seen, largely the majority of people are starting to move towards net zero contracts. What will happen with the Global New Deal is a continuation of the fossil fuel hanging a noose above our heads.
Okay. So thank you, Lumumba. Uh, Two big points from you actually is the need for urgent action on climate change, particularly considering that the impact on countries in the global south and the need for that urgent action here in the UK or here in the north. And then also the failure or the continuing failure of the north for appropriate action. And we have seen that in negotiation. We have seen that on the current set of whole solutions that are being pushed globally and especially being pushed to the global south to accept net zero, wherein the barometer of ambition was all pegged on net zero, which is a big myth, a big hoax. And then also all those other solutions on finance, all other solutions on how on the disproportionate sharing of commitment and also on on the commitments that we are seeing since 2015 from the Paris Agreement. So the second speaker that I would call next is a legal specialist and an international expert on reparations, or she's working on reparatory social justice for many years now. She's a political advisor, scholar, activist, historian, and educator. So on the personal, political, and professional level of works, she's trying to push and also make it popular, because our challenge as well is to make the progressive popular and the popular progressive. So she's trying to push that uh, so that the idea of repairing the historical and ongoing damage to African people not just accepted and deeply acknowledged, but also have an accountability as well from countries like you in the UK. So I would like to call Esther Stanford Kusei to have the floor.
Thank you. Okay, this is it. I've got greetings, everyone. Greetings. Am I speaking correctly?
Yeah.
Is this?
Great. And I'm just going to slow it down a tiny
Okay.
bit.
Thank you for that introduction, and of course to Global Justice Now for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I just want to share some perspectives from the international social movement for African reparations, of which I'm a very active member, involved in various reparations movements around the world, and also where my activism and that of many others I work with interfaces with issues of climate injustice and the whole arena of what is now being called climate reparations. So I'm really going to share a perspective in terms of from the ground and movements which I believe are more holistic and don't just kind of isolate different aspects of the harm that we're experiencing in terms of this polycrisis. And for coming from a people who have experienced and survived many existential threats throughout time and throughout centuries, then I think it's important to share those wider perspectives, just as a contribution. So as a reparationist, and involved with movements around the world, and also as part of emerging environmental movements in the global north that work in harmony and in partnership with movements in the global south, I think it's important to say that for some of us, we don't isolate climate reparations. You know, that's a particularly interesting phenomenon. You know, going to official climate negotiations, and there are different starting points in terms of when this term, climate reparations, began to be popular and began to be used. So I prefer to talk about reparations, holistic reparations, because actually, I think what's important to recognize is that we can see, and what we are seeing, is an NGOization of reparatory justice resistance, whereby the cognitive ideals, the visions, the cosmologies, the epistemologies of many movements on the grounds are being invisibilized because NGOs in particular find it more, you know, easy to deal with particular sections of the harm. And from a movement perspective on the ground, we find this quite problematic, and I have to share this with you. It's important to recognize that as movements that we have our own epistemologies and cosmologies that challenge dominant colonial and Eurocentric framings and reductive framings of what the repair is. So we don't see the harm as just being about the climate, okay? As African peoples, and other indigenous peoples of the earth who have actually been on the front lines of defending against climate and ecological emergencies for centuries. And the whole issue of even colonization and industrial revolution, we know, is interconnected with the beginnings of this period called the Anthropocene. And others, you know, there's the Capitalocene, and, you know, we can gender it, and there's been all different theorizations. So it's not new to us, okay? And the problem when we just take a piece of a radical idea that we've been working towards in terms of transformation of our societies and that have actually emboldened our anti-colonial activism is that we end up having very narrow solutions as to what we think we can do to remedy those harms. All right. So the key thing is that where we're at now, it requires us to go back to the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples to really look at how we transform and bring about a paradigm shift in our own way as human beings of relating to Mother Earth and to each other that have brought us to a precipice where literally none of us are guaranteed a future, as we've heard, if things continue down this route. And of course, those in the global south, in the majority world, most harmed by this, okay? And this reductive kind of way of just isolating climate reparations, you know, as I said, leads us to the wrong solutions or the wrong starting points. So one of the things I'd like to add in here is that we must also, in our activism and organizing, in terms of being the change and bringing about the change, recognize the importance of cognitive justice. Cognitive justice in terms of the way that we see the issue, the way we see the problem, and therefore how we address it. And so there can be no actual climate justice if we don't have global cognitive justice, okay? And recognize the framings of African and indigenous peoples who have been championing reparations for centuries. So this notion of climate reparations, what is it? You know, a lot of NGOs in particular and are reducing it to this notion of loss and damage, which is not holistic reparations. That's something totally different. But there is a particular definition of climate reparations that was advanced by Professor Maxine Burkett, an African-American professor of law. And she basically says climate reparations are a process instigated and propelled by the moral challenge of a massive wrong to construct methods to improve the lives of current victims into the future. Climate reparations is the effort to assess the harm caused by the past emissions of the major polluters and to improve the lives of the climate vulnerable through direct programs, policies, and or mechanisms for significant resource transfers to assure the ability of the climate vulnerable to contemplate a better livelihood in light of future climate challenges. Keston Perry, another academic, argues climate reparations constitute a program for loss and damage to livelihoods, infrastructure, and people's life chances due to ecological breakdown. Okay, so this question.
Who's this name?
Keston Perry.
Who? I don't see something Maxine Burkett.
Maxine Burkett was the first person. Burkett. B-U-R-K-E-T-T. Okay? K-E-T-T. Maxine Burkett. So this question then of climate reparations, as it has been defined, again, doesn't go towards the definition of holistic reparations. Now, the key thing to know about reparations is that there is no universal theory for all peoples on the planet around reparations. And there is, the notion of taking on board cognitive justice. Many indigenous peoples of the Americas, so-called, actually argue that you cannot address reparations for Native American people without embracing Native American epistemologies of what the harm is. And a big part of that harm is the continued dispossession and disconnection from our Mother Earth, what people would call land. But land not as property, as it has come to be defined in terms of systems of colonialism, okay? But land as mother, land as actual relationship. So a big part of our reparations, certainly from the perspective of the International Social Movement for African Reparations, is about re-envisioning reparations as holistic repairs, including a return to the ways of our mother, which we call rematriation. And rematriation is a goal of many indigenous nations, and it involves simple notions. I'm sure you would have heard of it: land back. Land back is rematriation. It's not saying we recognize property. It's about saying we recognize that we have a relationship with our Mother Earth. And indigenous peoples have lived in harmony with Mother Earth for centuries. And that was torn asunder. And that's where we saw the beginnings of this crisis, where we felt we could actually despoil our mother, which goes contrary to our knowledge systems as indigenous peoples. Okay, so land back. We know that indigenous peoples, so-called, actually protect 80% of remaining biodiversity. That's why land back is essential. And more than land back, the repair that we recognize is holistic repair, not only of us as people who have been impacted, but also the repairs that we have to do with our Mother Earth. And that is known as planet repairs, which is this combination between reparatory justice, environmental justice, and cognitive justice. At the moment, I'm involved with a network called INASAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. And this is our current research phase, re-envisioning reparations as a return to our Mother Earth or rematriation, cultural, spiritual, and environmental repair, getting back onto the land, building relationships with land and our connection to land, that land that we call ours, that makes us indigenous. And when you have been dispossessed of land and your connection, there is that separation and that enemy. And there's something even deeper if we go into the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples, the Algonquin notion of wetiko, which basically speaks to a cannibalizing spirit that eats not just people, but literally this notion that we can eat the earth. That's what the extractivism is doing. African people talk about Urugu, coming from the peoples of Mali, Dogon peoples. That a Urugu is an incomplete being that basically actually lives in discord with itself, with others, and those around it. So these are some of the notions that we're working with. And we have to look at how do we ourselves transform this ability now to destroy our planet? What's going wrong in our psyches? Because it's a lot deeper than just the technical fixes. And that is why in the International Social Movement for African Reparations, our vision of the rematriation and the planet repairs is known as Ma'atu Buntu Man in Ubuntu Dunia. And that simply is a repaired Africa that's based on Pan-Africanism, not preserving the borders of European coloniality. But that cannot happen in a disrepaired world. And so our movements are catalyzing and working in partnership and solidarity with other reparations movements who are also transforming the world. And that world, that multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice is known as Ubuntu Dunia, based on the Bantu-speaking peoples of Southern Africa, this notion of Ubuntu, that we are people through how we treat others. That is the mark of our humanness. And there is a need for a rehumanization where we once again rediscover who we are and what our mission and purpose is. And we can't leave it just to states, and we can't leave it just to the corporations. The change and the adaptations, the stopping of the harm has to come from the people below, because they are already re-envisioning and prefiguring that new world. And she is definitely on her way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Esther, for your powerful words. And they're also powerful because it's very, it turns around what we think here when in terms of development, when in terms of, how things are done. So this idea also, these ideas that Esther shared is a radical alternative. It's also an alternative that many people in the South already know and have been practicing, has been living. And these alternatives are being pushed, and the only reason they're not being accepted is because they are from the South. And that at the same time it's so different from the way that governments, corporations, and policymakers are so used to. No one will make a profit when we say that land is for everyone, and that private property is sacred. It's a totally a different take on what we should be doing and we should be believing. So thank you for those radical thoughts, and also for your powerful words. So our next and last speaker is our own. So he joined Global Justice Now in 2019. Also have a background in history and with specialization in Latin America. And his work also is mainly on aid, but then also part of that is on climate, on finance, and also climate justice. So there's a funny cluster of issues that he takes. I said funny because it's a lot. It's all related, and at the same time so huge. So many of you have already met him in some of the local group meetings that you organize. So I'm talking about Daniel Willis. So Daniel.
Might have to adjust the camera, I think.
A bit more.
Oh, that's a big adjustment.
Yeah,
And where's the microphone?
that thing there.
This, okay.
Just not to. I think that's good.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, yeah, first of all, I'd just like to give thanks to Esther and Lumumba, to both of them for their powerful contributions on this subject, and really for bringing such kind of deep and rich perspectives to the kind of the topics that we wanted to discuss. My job really is to maybe sort of narrow in a little bit on how some of these narratives connect to the work that Global Justice Now has been doing in the past, and also how we might try to build on it in the future. But yeah, I mean, I think firstly, I think it's worth saying that this holistic view of reparations that Esther's so particularly picked up on, I think is absolutely crucial for us to think about. The American scholar Olufemi Taiwo talked about reparations as being a project of world building, of not simply kind of compensation, but a project to remake the world in response to what he calls global racial empire. And he uses that phrase really to describe the world that we live in today, that he says is has kind of been built and shaped since that kind of colonial counter of the past few hundred years. So when we look around our kind of societies today, our laws, the things that we eat and consume and how much, our international institutions, our universities, but also our national institutions, governments, and our trade rules, and other aspects of our economies and societies, all of these things are deeply, deeply shaped by how the world was governed and how wealth, resources, and people were extracted from the global south for hundreds of years. And he says specifically that the projects of climate justice and reparations are one and the same. The climate crisis arises from the same political history as racial injustice, and that these things kind of have to be considered hand in hand when we're talking about reparations. So some of the reasons why these things, just a few kind of further examples, I guess, of what the deep connections between these two apparently separate but really very connected things are. In Bolivia, at the sort of start of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, there was a mine in a region called Potosi, and this mine was infamous for being kind of one of the most barbaric and brutal labor systems in the world. Indigenous communities across Bolivia and Latin America were forced into labor in the Potosi mines, and the silver was dug out and shipped around the world, particularly to China. And that kind of extractive industry has been happening in Bolivia and Latin America for hundreds of years. Today, mining companies continue this process, digging out copper and gold and other minerals to sell abroad and to keep extracting that wealth. And actually in Potosi, now the same industrialists and super rich people like Elon Musk are hovering around trying to dig lithium out of the ground this time to support their version of a green transition, because lithium's so central to the technology for electric cars. So really, it was the response to this kind of crisis of colonialism and climate change, of the environment being destroyed, this kind of ecocidal approach that both the Spanish took, but also the international companies have taken since, which was why the government of Evo Morales and the social movements that worked together to put him in power was such a popular movement in the kind of early 21st century. Really, the movements involved in that envision not just responding to climate change and having this project to reduce carbon emissions or whatever, but also to respect the rights of Mother Earth and to write into legislation, as they did, that they were going to protect Earth and the resources of Bolivia. Now, what happened ultimately was that government ran into a lot of the problems that lots of national projects for liberation do, is that they were deeply sort of restrained by what they could do within international markets, international institutions, punished them for taxing corporations, and after kind of commodity prices fell, they were forced back into this position of actually just replicating that kind of extractivist approach. But that was a product mainly of the colonial structures of our kind of international economy. In what's called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in recent years, we've been working with communities and labourers who work for a company called Feronia. This is a company that's been funded by the UK aid budget for a number of years. despite those workers having taken out a mediation process and complaints procedure against Feronia for the poverty wages that they pay, for violent aggression and suppression of protests, and for the agricultural processes, which are hugely damaging to the local environment and agriculture. And these communities envision their demands, again, in terms of partly wanting financial compensation for the poor wages they've been paid, but also a demand for the land back from the company. Indeed, that land was actually the taking of that land was not by Feronia, but it was 100 years previous by the Belgian government, and it was given to Lord Leverhulme, who was ultimately the founder of the corporation Unilever. So the demands that these workers and the communities locally make now are for a range of different things that could all be considered part of a kind of demand for reparations. They want to support the local environment by introducing more agroecological processes. They want their land back so that they can initiate that, but also they're demanding compensation and an apology from Feronia in international courts. So again, these kind of climate and responses to climate change and colonialism linked together again. In Mozambique, there's in recent years been numerous incredibly severe cyclones Kenneth and Idai, and then again at the start of this year, Tropical Storm Anna affected Mozambique again. The response of the international community and governments in the global north to these events, there's been three responses. First of all has been to give more aid to Mozambique, but always very, very small amounts, and always given via various contractors and private sector companies so that profit is creamed off the top. The second response has been to burden Mozambique with huge amounts of debt. Mozambique had to take a huge loan out from the IMF to fund the rebuilding of their communities after those storms because the aid wasn't enough. And then the third response has been to force the Mozambique government and people down this pathway of fossil fuel development. The British government's given $1 billion to a project to export liquefied natural gas from Mozambique, which has displaced communities, it's displaced fishermen and fisherwomen from their jobs, and it's exacerbating local tensions and violent conflict in the area as well. So again, if we were to consider a kind of program of reparations for Mozambique, it can't just be simply paying the money that would have been needed in response to those storms. It has to be about stopping the harm that the fossil fuel investments are making and supporting those communities to rebuild and adapt to the future, but also about releasing Mozambique from the kind of colonial relationships that the IMF continues to hold it under. And yeah, as we've already heard, from the period from 1750 to 1950, when the kind of a lot of the basis of what we call climate change was laid out, $45 trillion was extracted from India, and vast amounts more from the continent of Africa. And this is the same period when emissions are sort of steeply going up for rich governments in the global north. And it's the ships and the boats that are extracting that wealth that are causing the emissions. It's the factories that are then burning the resources in Manchester and the north of England and across Europe. So these two processes are inseparable, and we have to always remember that. So to some extent, kind of challenging the world that we live in and the injustices that are kind of tied to these things is something that Global Justice Now was set up to do. In our trade campaign, we targeting the corporate courts that were created specifically in response to independence movements across Africa and Latin America to protect investors. And tackling that has been a part of our work for a number of years. On migration, we've done work tackling the hostile environment and more recently criticizing the government and trying to get the deportation flights to Rwanda stopped. And of course, the migration system is something that was built as a response to the end of empire, the so-called end of empire, and to refuse the kind of historic responsibility that Britain had to the world. But I think, also we do have to always consider what more we can do, and also kind of respond to the demands that are being made by movements across the global south at the minute, and to some of the key battles and opportunities that we have in the present minute. So I think the first thing that we will continue to do, but we'll look at even more in this context, is how we can stop the harm being done by the UK government, by UK finance and UK corporations across the world. So, for instance, we've been involved in the campaigns to stop the finance to the Mozambique gas project and other projects that have been developed with UK support in that country. Supporters, I'm sure, who are in this room have been involved locally in campaigns to stop the expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport, to stop the opening of the Cumbria coal mine, and the kind of expansion and continued operation of the Drax power station. And all of those things are part of the process, I guess, of trying to stop and reduce the harm that the UK is doing by emitting a lot of carbon. The second thing I think that's really key is to start making the demands that it's the polluters that need to pay for reparations, and really making sure that we highlight who that is, that they take responsibility for the damage that they've done. There's a huge amount of banks, insurance companies, financiers and asset managers in the City of London who benefited and profited not just from the colonial period, but also from financing fossil fuels and extractive projects today. And our history shows that actually it's often the polluters who receive the compensation, whether it's through corporate courts and them getting big payouts to protect their profits, or in cases like when Haiti gained independence, or when, after the abolition of slavery by the British government, the huge amounts of compensation that was paid to former slaveholders. We need to reverse that, and we need to make sure that it's the corporations and the polluters who are paying, not just fossil fuel companies, but also banks, defense companies, etc. And then I think a key thing that we kind of always hear from our allies is this issue of the repayment of this ecological debt. And this could take many forms. This is the ecological debt that movements have highlighted previously, as covers many forms. It does include some forms of loss and damage, and there are calls for for compensation from big polluters in the global north. But this is also alongside kind of structural support for the global south via things like debt cancellation, removing the patents from green technology, and working to diminish or reform the impact of international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And all those things are kind of within the scope of work that we will continue to do on this. But it's been, a huge honor to speak with Lumumba and Esther today. We'll continue to kind of think more about how we respond to some of their comments as well. And really try and take them on board and push forward for this kind of project of building a more just world. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So as you can see, we really have a huge task ahead, not just on stopping the harm, but also calling out the insufficient remedies that are in place and being promoted, not just by government, but by also corporations. Because as we know now, although it is very, very difficult to be a climate denialist, the thing is, many of those corporations and many of those who did harm are also promoting themselves as part of the solutions. And so that's also another huge task that we are also addressing in all our work. So we have about roughly 12 to 15 minutes for our open forum for Q&A, and I will try to get at least 2 rounds, so and have a quick response from our speaker. So that means if you can summarize your comment or question within 1 minute, that will help us a lot. So floor is now open. Yes, please. Are there other hands? I wanted to see the hands so that I can call. So the lady with stripes, you, and then you as well. So all women at the front first.
Thank you very much. Brilliant speech. Really simple question. A really simple, clear, obviously straightforwardly put issue of the slide or the risk of NGOism. How does global justice now work to make sure that we don't slip into that, or that we're not already doing that? What are our key guiding principles to make sure that that isn't happening or doesn't happen?
So the question is on how do we not fall on the trend of NGOization? That's also actually a big call from the South, because they're also saying that the Southern movements are getting more and more NGOized. Okay, so second question, please.
I would say that at the moment, the bloke who's investing in Twitter, he's decided to not invest in Twitter. So
Elon
perhaps
Musk.
finally, this multi-millionaire billionaire is actually starting to listen. You know, perhaps his children have reminded him that the world has a future and he needs to get on with it.
Okay, yes, please. So the second comment is on Elon Musk, Twitter, investing on Twitter, probably change his mind. Where can we attribute that from? Yes, please.
I'd just like to thank the three speakers who were excellent. But how does global justice decide on what campaigns to actually fund or promote? How do they decide on that?
So how do we choose?
How do you choose?
So the question on how do we choose the campaigns and what we wanted to. Okay, maybe I'll get two more questions, yes, please, and then.
The biggest problem I have is that my experience is that nobody is prepared to accept responsibility as individuals for their actions. The argument, because China is a terrible polluter, means that what's the point of us doing anything in Britain is the usual response. I've talked to people I know socially, I might make some comment, but they don't actually believe that what they do is their responsibility. It's always somebody else. And so you don't also get any mention in the press of these sort of views being expressed here today. So the question is, how do you get people to take individual responsibility? And why are people like Global Justice and Neil basically ignored by most of the mainstream press? And how can we get that changed?
So question, how do we get that message across on responsibility, both individual and also institutional level? Yeah, because now blame game is like others are more responsible, when in fact we do have a big responsibility here. Yeah, okay. I'm just making it clear for the people on YouTube, because unfortunately as well they could not comment. Maybe they, I don't know, maybe they're putting comments, but they could not raise questions. So yes, please.
Yes, this is a question for
I don't know. I called her. I'll call you on the second round. Don't worry.
It's a comment
So I'll
from
copy your mic.
question about Green New Deal. When you mentioned Green New Deal a little bit, I think you were talking about the greenwash of Western governments and the big corporations, and talking about getting the world to net zero by 2050, which is also a complete disaster. Whereas the global Green New Deal, as espoused by somebody like Assad Rayman, is a fantastic vision of a totally just planet where we share our resources and we tackle the climate and we all work together to create a future that we're all looking for. So I just hate anybody to go away thinking, oh, Green New Deal is a complete bad idea.
Yeah. Okay, so we have those questions. So I would call on our speaker. So maybe the risk of NGOization can be responded to by Esther. And then how GJN chose the campaigns, Daniel can address that. And on the question of the Green New Deal, since that's a question directly addressed to Lumumba. So Esther, I'll call you first.
So from my perspective,
You need to. Sorry, you need to come.
Okay. So from my perspective, working with NGOs in a very critical way, critical engagement, it is about ensuring that there's equity in the relations. It is about respecting the paradigms and framings of movements, communities of resistance. It is about finding and identifying actual communities of resistance and their own organizing frameworks, not just sister NGOs that we have cordial relationships with in the global south. And this is one of the things that I model. So I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network, and our work supports communities of resistance in the global south who are unfunded, are not NGOs, and their own organizing structures which promote the holistic reparation. So that's what I would say from, looking outside in, what would need to happen. Also credit the lineages of ideas and struggles and concepts and terminologies. If it wasn't for us who were reparationists, who at the time when I started, if to be championing reparations, I would have been classified as what today is known as a Black identity extremist. Okay, it was an extremist idea. And it is because we've lost people. People have been assassinated, and the movements have continued, that we have worked, we have sought to influence hearts and minds in the global north. Why so many of you can now take this up and actually get paid for doing it. Remember, the movements don't. We, the activists, don't. So I think it is also about retaining humility in the service of knowing that one is just following on in footsteps that were not created by yourselves.
Maybe I'll call Lumumba first. Also, if you could also respond to the question of on the idea of responsibility, then the putting blame on groups, individuals, entities that should be blamed and all that.
Thank you. The difficulty about answering questions in situations like this is that the questions are very hard, and you need time to think about them, okay, and reflect on them. So I'll ask. Let me say this: the ideas that are espoused by Asad Rahman are not what I am referring to when I'm talking about.
I'll hear you.
The ideas that are promoted by Asad Rahman on the global Green Deal are not what I'm talking about. In fact, his perspective on the global New Deal is absolutely correct because it's based on a very single important issue, which is justice. And as such, he's definitely advancing the discussion and the debate around, okay, the Green New Deal. But actually, the advocates of the New Deal and the global New Deal are the corporate and the state powers. And they're the ones who are making those deals, okay, without any participation by any democratic movement, etc., etc. And in my humble view, having been in that front, okay, is that they will not engage any true thinking on ecological reform or energy transition or radical reductions of emissions, etc. So I just want to mention that because it's true that having said that, it doesn't mean that we will not reach there. When I was advocating on certain things in 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, when I was told off, the change did happen 8 years later, 2018. A lot of the terminology that I was using was considered to be psychologically daft, okay, death, etc., etc. Now the United Nations Secretary General is using the same terminology, last. Okay, okay, they do not speak, they refuse to talk about the damage to the global south, etc., etc. We were not. At the end of the day, when Copenhagen and when Paris Agreement was behind the doors between the biggest polluters sitting alone, not the rest of the world. So in that. Now that raises the question of responsibility. I think it was Lord Anthony Gifford who said, I do not have to be a woman to fight for women's rights or advocate women's rights. I do not have to be black to talk about racism. The same thing he speaks about the question of true ecological perspective. There will be denialists that you are going to face who do not accept any responsibility, who do not believe that they are racist, who do not believe they are sexist, who do not believe they are anti LGBTQ, and the rest. But that does not stop us from having to fight and work to convince them that they are wrong. And time will prove them wrong. It's you have to effectively adopt a very messianic perspective and advocate and advocate and advocate and struggle. There's no shortcuts. And this brings me to something that she mentioned, Esther mentioned. We live in an age of epistemic violence. You will be shut down and you will be cancelled and all sorts of things. Okay, so to that extent, what some you need really meaningful dialogue with them because they just simply misguided, and that necessitate both an opening their minds and open-mindedness from their perspective, and even healing themselves psychologically to accept a logic that they do not accept. I think this is like, and you can think about what Foucault said, what Fanon said, what Du Bois said about these issues. My final point is with regard to, it's a quick comment on individualization. The truth is, the West dominates all the spheres. It's part of it. It's part of the power structure extending, okay, and like a cancer, okay, subverting anything. Just think about your treasury. They commit, let's say, 60 million for aid. 60% of that comes back. Salaries for etc., etc., etc. So we have to fight that process, because the bigger picture of what Esther and Daniel spoke about, and I've been speaking about, this is a civilizational change. It's not simply about a simple matter of just like stopping this form of industrialization. If this industrialization, if it goes with its injustice, with its inequality, with whatever, okay, we are not helping the world. What we need to build is a just, sustainable, equitable, ecologically sound world, a world for the future and for the current generations. The future generations, we have moral obligations not to destroy the world. And in doing that, we'll have to do a lot of fighting.
So yeah, the question. Sorry, I couldn't see who asked it, but the question: how do we choose our campaigns? So a lot of our work on climate justice actually came from a motion passed by members a few years ago, I think before the pandemic, asking us to do more on climate justice and particularly to work with our allies in the global south to shape that campaign. And we've been speaking with those allies ever since that. We did quite a lot on kind of climate finance and issues connected to kind of these themes and run up to COP26. And then we've sort of tried to continue developing it again with allies and keep speaking to people to kind of find out where the next kind of opportunities and the most logical next steps are, really. So it's always a bit of an evolving process, and one that's kind of we try to get input from members and sort of other people within the sector, and but also most importantly from the global south. And I think the other question was on how do we get people to accept responsibility and kind of get this message out to the media. I mean, I slightly disagree with the premise that we're being completely ignored in the media. I mean, like our campaigns around equitable vaccine access were, equally sort of derided as being quite extreme a few years ago. And then, the pandemic demonstrated what an absolutely vital issue that was. And the issue of intellectual property is not the most kind of easiest thing to talk about with public audiences, but it's become a huge theme of that campaign and in the media as a result of having that opportunity. So I think having done a lot of the work and groundwork in at the right time and making sure that you're kind of on the right page with these things is absolutely important. But we've got a decent track record of getting things that working on things that seem like extreme issues and as Dottie said, kind of making them the kind of popular alternative. So I think it's a lot of work and a long process, but it does work sometimes. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Well, I have to give my huge apologies because now James is reminding me that we need a break. And for those that put up their hands, you can also approach all our speakers during the tea break. And after the tea break, we will go to two workshops. One is on the corporate court versus the climate, which will be here in the main hall. We have the vaccine appetite to the global south, right to health, which will be in the small classroom. I think there will be signage where the small classroom is. That will be with Tim.
Should I?
In the small classroom. And then there's death and climate justice in the large classroom. So there will be signs on the door where to go. And
Shall I just?
Okay.
Yeah, literally for the both the small classroom and the large classroom, you walk back past where the registration desk was when you came in. It's the other side of the registration desk, and they're on the right and left respectively. So
yeah.
You're not doing the vaccine workshop.
No, there is.
There
There's the
is.
vaccine
There's-
workshop is in the small classroom.
There's 3 workshops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were 3. So will be here. So the corporate court one here, the vaccine workshop in the small classroom, and the Jubilee for Climate workshop with death and climate justice is in the large classroom. So this is just the opening, and we still have those workshops and also the closing panel where we will also say moving forward, because the opening normally is where the dark and the grim discussions happen, because we're talking about what is the current situation. Although we've already discussed about some of the alternatives, but in those workshops as well, we will both discuss what is the situation and what alternatives, what actions we are doing, and finally, please stay as well for the closing, because that is how we move forward. That will be the discussion. From this panel, we have touched more on power, the question of power. And I think that is a key element in when we say we wanted to push for climate justice, for reparation, and for just alternatives. And I think that question of changing power relations, first and foremost, must happen here as well, in the UK, because our policies here affect the policies in the global south. So let's bear that in mind and have a wonderful discussion, productive discussions in the workshops. Enjoy tea, approach our speakers, or approach all of those with the Global Justice Now shirts as well if you wanted to know more and about the campaign. So thank you very much. You have announcement, Jean? Okay. So for those on YouTube, so
I just wanted to also remind, like, there's tea now for the next 10 minutes or so in there. There's also, of course, all materials from all of our campaigns. Please do, we don't want to take those back with us. Take some if you want them to distribute however you like. And there's the bookshop if you haven't had a look as well. It's a radical local bookseller. So thanks.
Let me thank you again.